The Honourable John Boscowan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a privilege to stand up and take a call this evening on the Victims of Crime Reform Bill. And I don't intend to take up my full 10-minute speaking slot, Mr Speaker, but of course one of the great privileges of being a Member of Parliament is to come into this chamber, to present one's views and to debate with fellow Members of Parliament. And so, Mr Speaker, given that I expect this will be my last week of Parliament and my last opportunity to do so, having listened to the debate, I felt honour bound to actually come down here and express some of those views. And Mr Speaker, we've heard in the House this afternoon the National Party crowing about the reduction in crime, the 7% reduction in crime nationally, as Amy Adams reminded us. And as we're hearing the interjection tonight, that's right. Well, it is right, Mr Speaker. It is right, and this government should be very proud of its achievement. It's very proud of its achievement in that regard, Mr Speaker, but it's a pity that Amy Adams didn't actually mention one other thing, because she talked about what the government had done, what the National Party had promoted, but it's a pity that she almost seemed too ashamed to refer to the ACT Party's three strikes legislation, Mr Speaker. The ACT Party campaigned on law and order and keeping the streets of this country safe, Mr Speaker, more than any other party in this Parliament, Mr Speaker, and it remains one of the great achievements of the ACT Party in the last 3 years to pass that legislation, Mr Speaker. And so I hear the heckles, but as we heard so proudly this afternoon from the Minister of Police, that crime is down 7%. Crime is down 7%. And why is that, Mr Speaker? Why is that? Well, sir, we're debating this evening, the Victims of Crime Reform Bill, but we should actually be looking at how you actually reduce the number of victims, Mr Speaker. Yes, we need to look at victims' rights. There's probably no party more concerned, Mr Speaker, about the victims of crime, but what the ACT Party, Mr Speaker, has done is to actually try and reduce that crime. And I'd like to remind the members of this House that one of the most important pieces of legislation that was passed in this Parliament was, in actual fact, ACT's Three Strikes Bill. And to remind members and to remind the public, Mr Speaker, that this Parliament has taken serious measures to punish repeat serious offenders. And to remind members that when someone comes up on their first charge, on their first serious violent offence, Mr Speaker, they are sentenced and they serve what the judge gives. They get parole, Mr Speaker. They get parole. When they come up, sir, when they come up on their second serious violent offence, Mr Speaker, they are denied parole. They have to serve the sentence they're given. It may not be the maximum sentence for that particular crime, Mr Speaker, but they have to serve what the court orders, Mr Speaker, and that's very important. But just as importantly, Mr Speaker, the judge gives them a very serious warning, Mr Speaker, and they're told if they come back before the court on a third serious offence, Mr Speaker, they will serve the maximum sentence. And so in reviewing the Criminal Procedures Bill, I know there are many criminal charges, Mr Speaker, which carry terms of 7 or 14 years in prison. So looking through the preamble to this bill, I see that one of the provisions of this bill is it will enable will widen the scope of what victims may include in their victim impact statements. It will widen the scope of what victims may include in their victim impact statements. And so when I think about victims and I think about victim impact statements, it's hard to ignore the work of the Sensible Sentencing Trust. If there is any organisation, Mr Speaker, that has stood up for the rights of victims, Mr Speaker, it is the Sensible Sentencing Trust. That is an organisation, Hawke's Bay based, operating throughout New Zealand, Mr Speaker, that actually stands up for the rights of victims. And so I salute the people who lead that organisation, and in particular I salute Garth and Anne McVicker. But I'd like to remind this House, Mr Speaker, this evening that there was another person who had worked very closely with the Sensible Sentencing Trust, and that's my former colleague David Garrett. And there is no person, Mr Speaker, who did more to push the three strikes legislation as David Garrett. His intimate knowledge, Mr Speaker, of criminal law and the work that the former leader, parliamentary leader of the ACT Party did, Rodney Hyde, to put that piece of legislation into place. And I think, Mr Speaker, we need to acknowledge those two people because, sir, reductions in crime just don't happen, Mr Speaker. There are things that drive it. And so we now have over 700 people, Mr Speaker, who actually are on their first strike. 700 people who have appeared before the court, have been convicted of a criminal offence and have been warned by the judge, that they come up before the court on a second occasion, they won't be getting parole, and should they come up a third time, Mr Speaker, they'll be serving the maximum sentence. So, Mr Speaker, also interesting to hear Amy Adams talk about the fact that for the large part of the last week that she and colleagues have been in the Justice Electoral Select Committee considering the video surveillance bill. And she said that she would much rather stand up for the victims of crime, sir, than the offenders. Much rather stand up for the victims of crime than the offenders. Well, like Stuart Nash, I would remind Amy Adams that all New Zealanders have rights. And yes, if you are convicted, Mr Speaker, you should be punished.
Order.
Sorry, Mr Speaker. If a person is convicted of a crime, they should be punished, Mr Speaker, and you lose your freedom. You lose your freedom, so the person is convicted, Mr Speaker, they lose their freedom, but they don't lose their rights, Mr Speaker. And it's interesting, Mr Speaker, that we've been debating earlier this afternoon the Criminal Procedures Bill, Mr Speaker, and one of the fundamental tenets of our Constitution is that you're not guilty unless it's proved beyond reasonable doubt. Not guilty unless it's proved beyond reasonable doubt. You shouldn't be required to assist in your own prosecution. And, sir, Mr Speaker, the ACT Party has had two great victories in the last couple of weeks. We have secured significant changes to the Criminal Procedures Bill. We were instrumental, Mr Speaker, in forcing the surveillance bill to a select committee, and we're going to see the results of that, Mr Speaker, on Thursday. But let me finish as I started, Mr Speaker. Probably one of our greatest achievements is passing the three strikes legislation, and the national members can stand up and they can talk about the 7% reduction in crime, but you actually need to look at why that has happened, Mr Speaker, why it has happened. Those sort of things don't happen by accident. And so the three strikes legislation is just another example of what the ACT Party has achieved in the last 3 years and why we should be returned to Parliament. Thank you.
Members, this debate is concluded. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Victims of Crime Reform Bill, first reading.
The Honourable Simon Power.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Victims of Crime Reform Bill be considered by the Justice and Electoral Committee.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Members, I require some assistance, and I've asked Jacinda Ardern to help me as we move into committee.
I call on Government Order of the Day number 18.